Intro. Tonight, let us travel north, not toward the clang of swords or the bright confusion of legends, but toward a quieter doorway, low and practical, set into the side of a winter farm. It is the Viking Age, somewhere between the late 8th and the 11th century, though no one inside this house would call it that. They would know the year by the age of a child, by the memory of a hard spring, by the quality of the hay, by the shape of the moon over a frozen yard. They would know it by whether the sheep were thriving, whether the roof needed patching, whether the grain bins seemed generous enough to trust. History gives us broad dates. A household gives us the small calendar of survival. Outside, the northern night has settled in with complete confidence. Snow lies in the hollows, frost has found the edges of every exposed thing. The track to the byre is a pale groove. The fence posts wear little caps of white. The air is so cold that sound seems to travel farther, and yet there is very little sound to travel. A creak of timber. A sheep shifting in shelter. Perhaps the soft complaint of a gate that will be mended when daylight and fingers are both less stiff. Inside the longhouse, warmth is not a single object. It is not a switch, not a dial, not a polite hum from behind a wall. Warmth is an arrangement. Warmth is architecture, clothing, labor, habit, memory, and cooperation. Warmth is where you place the bed platform, how thickly you bank the turf walls, how carefully you mend a mitten, how well you dried the firewood, how many people sit close to the hearth without knocking over the cooking pot. Warmth is also restraint, not opening the door too often, not wasting fuel, not letting the embers die because someone assumed someone else was watching them. In a Norse farm household, winter was not merely endured by being brave. It was managed by being sensible. This is less dramatic, which is why it is so often left out of stories, but it is much more useful if you wish to get through January. The people we are visiting are not fantasy Vikings. No horned helmets hang by the door. No one is dressed for a modern costume parade. They are farmers, herders, spinners, woodcutters, children, elders, hired hands, and kin. They live in a world that may include travel and trade, law assemblies and storytelling, distant markets and skilled craft, but tonight the central question is wonderfully plain: how do we keep warm until morning? The answer begins with the house itself. Before we step fully inside, it is worth letting the cold have its proper size. Northern winter was not identical everywhere the Norse lived. A farm near the Danish lowlands, a settlement in western Norway, a homestead in Iceland, and a household in the North Atlantic islands all met different winds, different timber supplies, different soils, and different lengths of daylight. Some winters were wet and raw. Some were dry and sharp. Some brought snow that lay deep against walls, others brought thaw, sleet, and mud that could chill a person more efficiently than clean frost. The shared problem was not one simple temperature. It was exposure, damp, darkness, fuel, food, and time. The people inside our doorway would not separate these things neatly. Warmth was not only a matter of feeling comfortable. It was tied to the health of animals, the dryness of grain, the workability of tools, the safety of infants, and the strength of people expected to rise before dawn. A house that was a little warmer meant that hands could mend longer. Dry mittens meant chores could be done without injury. A preserved ember meant breakfast could begin sooner. Enough sleep meant fewer mistakes with axes, knives, animals, and fire. So tonight we are not looking for one secret Viking trick. We are looking at a system. The system is quiet enough to miss if we only search the past for spectacle. It is made from ordinary decisions: where to build, how to roof, when to cut fuel, how to store hay, who sleeps where, which garment is patched first, how much flame is truly needed, and who is trusted to remember the embers. These decisions, repeated across many households and many winters, are the real subject of our visit. There is comfort in that. A winter farm does not survive because every moment is dramatic. It survives because most moments are not. Someone remembers. Someone checks. Someone tightens a peg, shakes snow from a cloak, moves a damp shoe away from sparks, and tells a sleepy child to keep the blanket over both feet. The northern night may be immense, but the household answers it in small measures, patiently applied. Segment 1: The Longhouse as a Winter Machine. A longhouse was not one single design repeated across all northern lands. It varied by region, wealth, available materials, and local building traditions. In Iceland, turf could be essential, thick and insulating, because timber was precious. In parts of Norway, timber might be more common, though still never something to waste. In Denmark or Sweden, walls might include posts, planks, wattle, daub, turf, or thatch in different combinations. Roofs might be covered with turf, reeds, straw, or wooden shingles where these were practical. The details changed from valley to coast, from one generation to another. But in winter, the purpose was shared. A house had to stand against wind, hold heat near people, keep stores dry enough, shelter work, shelter sleep, and often shelter animals nearby. It had to do this without glass windows in the modern sense, without central heating, without a chimney as later houses would know it, and without the luxury of pretending the outside world was not there. Imagine the longhouse as a patient, low creature pressed close to the earth. Its roof slopes downward, heavy with thatch or turf. Its walls are thick where they can be. The doorway is not grand. Grand doorways are for losing heat and impressing visitors with your poor judgment. A smaller entrance is better. Sometimes there may be a porch-like passage or an entry space that slows the wind before it reaches the main room. Every little barrier matters. The building works with the landscape. It may be set so that the worst winds do not strike the door directly. It may nestle into a slope or stand near other farm structures that break the weather. Snow itself, once settled, can become a kind of insulation around low walls, though no one romanticizes digging through it when chores call. Inside, the main room is long and dim. The hearth lies along the center, not always a neat little fireplace but an open fire area where flame and ember do many jobs. It cooks food. It gives light. It dries damp wool. It warms bodies and tools and tired hands. Smoke rises upward and searches for a way out through roof openings, smoke holes, vents, and the inevitable gaps of a building that breathes. This is important. A Viking Age longhouse was often smoky by modern standards. Smoke did not politely vanish. It drifted, layered, darkened beams, scented clothing, discouraged insects, and made eyes water when the draft was poor. The upper air could be thick while the lower space, where people sat and lay, remained more tolerable. People learned the moods of their own houses. They knew when the wind pushed smoke down, when to adjust a vent, when to add wood, when to leave a fire as embers rather than flame. The hearth was the glowing heart, but the house was the body that kept that heart useful. Along the sides of the room, benches or raised platforms provided places to sit, work, and sleep. Being raised mattered. The floor could be cold, packed earth or planking over earth, sometimes strewn with rushes, straw, or other material. Cold settles low. Dampness also has a talent for finding feet. A platform lifts the sleeper into a slightly kinder layer of air and away from the worst chill of the ground. The placement of people in the house was not random. Those with higher status might have particular places. Children might be tucked where they could share warmth. Elders, whose bones felt the cold with an old familiarity, might be given a sheltered sleeping spot. Guests, when present, altered the whole geometry of comfort. Hospitality was important, but so was not freezing your grandmother. The longhouse gathered heat from many small sources. The fire gave obvious heat. The people gave heat. The animals, if housed in an adjoining section or under the same roof in a byre area, gave heat too. Cattle and sheep are not decorative, and they are not scentless, but in winter they are warm living bodies. Their presence could help moderate temperatures within a connected building. There were trade-offs, of course. Moisture, smell, muck, and the daily obligation to tend them did not disappear because their bodies radiated warmth. But on a northern farm, comfort was rarely pure. It was negotiated. The house also stored warmth in mass. Thick turf walls, packed earth, heavy timbers, and thatched roofs did not heat quickly like a small metal stove, but they slowed change. They resisted sudden cold. A well-built turf wall is not glamorous, unless one has lived through a hard wind, in which case glamour can be reconsidered. Winter preparation began long before the longest nights. A family did not wait until the first deep frost to wonder whether the roof leaked. Roofs were patched in better weather. Turf was cut and laid. Thatch was repaired. Gaps were stuffed. Doors were checked. Firewood was gathered, split, stacked, and dried as well as circumstances allowed. Peat might be cut and dried in some regions. Brushwood, driftwood, and scraps all had uses. The fuel pile was a winter calendar, every piece burned was one less between the household and spring. This made the hearth both comfort and arithmetic. A modern person might say, casually, add another log. A Norse farmer might hear in that phrase the sound of future labor. A log is not simply a log. It is a tree felled with tools, cut, hauled, dried, stacked, protected from rain, and carried in by someone whose fingers may already be cracked from cold. It is also tomorrow's heat. So the fire is tended carefully. It is fed enough, not always generously. Flames are pleasant, but embers are efficient. The goal is not to create a roaring festive blaze every hour. The goal is to keep a working warmth alive. A longhouse at night might hold a low red glow rather than bright flame. Ash is drawn over embers to preserve them. A banked fire can sleep, in its way, and be awakened before dawn. If it dies completely, someone must relight it by whatever means are available, and on a freezing morning that is a punishment best avoided. A household that tends embers well has a small advantage over the dark. Light itself was part of winter warmth, if not in temperature then in spirit. The hearth gave flickering light. Oil lamps could be used, depending on region and resources, with animal fat or fish oil. But light was precious, and winter evenings did not become bright simply because people wished them to. Much work was done in dimness, close to flame, by memory and touch. Hands knew what eyes could not see clearly. A spindle can turn in low light. A needle can find a familiar path. A story can be told in complete darkness. The house made sound differently in winter. Snow outside muffled the world. Inside, every small domestic noise became part of the shelter, the scrape of a bowl, the creak of a loom weight, the soft hiss when damp wood objected to the fire, the low breathing of sleepers, the animal movements beyond a partition. Heat was heard as much as felt. A lively crackle could cheer a room. A sudden quiet might prompt someone to nudge the embers. Ventilation required judgment. Keep too much smoke inside, and the house becomes unpleasant and unhealthy. Let too much air pass through, and the warmth goes with it. The smoke hole, roof gaps, door, and wall openings were not modern engineered systems. They were managed by experience. A person might know from the direction of the wind whether the fire would draw well. They might shift fuel, adjust coverings, or simply endure a smoky hour with the resignation of someone who understands that winter has opinions. There is something deeply practical in this arrangement. The longhouse did not defeat winter. It edited winter. It took the enormous cold outside and reduced it to a manageable chill inside. It turned lethal wind into drafts that could be blocked with a cloak. It turned darkness into a fire-lit room. It turned isolation into a cluster of warm bodies and shared tasks. We should not over-soften it. The floor was cold. Smoke stung. Bedding might harbor fleas. Damp wool smelled like damp wool, a fact no poetry can fully improve. People coughed. Fingers cracked. A child might cry because the door opened and a blade of cold air crossed the room like a knife. But the house was still a marvel of accumulated knowledge. It was a winter machine built without motors, running on fuel, livestock, insulation, custom, and attention. Think of the roof. Above the household, the roof held down warmth and held out weather. A turf roof, where used, was heavy and insulating. It might grow grasses in warmer seasons, so that the house seemed almost to have borrowed a piece of hillside and worn it as a hat. Beneath it, rafters and beams darkened over time from smoke. Soot gathered. The smell of the house became the smell of wood smoke, wool, stored food, leather, people, and animals. To the family, this was not an aesthetic choice. It was home. The walls could be lined, patched, and thickened. Drafts were enemies that announced themselves with cold fingers. A crack near a sleeping platform might be stuffed with moss, wool scraps, straw, or whatever would work. A family learned the weak places in its house the way one learns the moods of an old relative. That corner sighs in a north wind. That door peg shrinks in dry cold. That patch of roof drips in thaw. That smoke hole behaves badly when the wind comes from the sea. The house was also social technology. It pulled people together. Privacy, in the modern sense, was thin. Warmth favored company. The best spot by the fire could not be occupied by everyone, and yet everyone depended on the fire. Daily life required negotiation, patience, and occasionally the kind of silence that says one has heard the same complaint about cold feet for many winters. Children learned warmth as a set of rules. Do not leave the door open. Do not scatter the straw from the sleeping place. Do not waste lamp oil. Do not poke the fire so enthusiastically that sparks leap where they should not. Bring in small wood before dark. Hang wet mittens where they will dry, but not so close that they scorch. If you must chase your sibling, do it away from the hearth, which is advice that has probably been ignored in every century. In winter, the longhouse was never just shelter. It was the main stage of life. Outdoor tasks continued, but the household center of gravity moved inward. Meals, repairs, textile work, tool maintenance, teaching, storytelling, planning, and sleep all gathered around heat. The architecture compressed the family into a pattern of survival. The central hearth made the room visible in pieces. Faces appeared and vanished in amber light. Steam rose from a pot. Shadows moved along beams. Wool hung to dry. A row of shoes or simple leather footwear might wait near warmth, not so near that they hardened or cracked. Wooden bowls and spoons sat ready. A dog, if allowed, understood the heat map of the room with professional accuracy. The dog, it must be said, would choose well. But the house alone was not enough. A person could sit in the best longhouse in the north and still shiver if dressed foolishly. The next layer of warmth was carried on the body, spun from fibers, sewn by hand, repaired again and again, and valued far beyond modern casual clothing. The first warmth of the longhouse began before a wall was raised. It began with the choice of site. A practical builder watched how water moved, how wind crossed the ground, where snow collected, and where animals and people would need to pass in bad weather. A slightly sheltered place could spare fuel over many winters. A poorly drained one could make dampness a permanent resident. Damp is one of winter's quieter enemies. It creeps into bedding, swells wood, spoils stores, and makes cold cling to the body. The orientation of a building could matter as much as its materials. A door facing the worst weather would punish the household every time it opened. A doorway protected by a fence, a bank, another outbuilding, or the shape of the land made daily life easier. None of this required a written architectural treatise. It required watching the weather for years and listening to people who had made mistakes before. Posts set into the earth, sill beams, turf blocks, wattled panels, planks, and roof supports all demanded maintenance. Archaeology gives us post holes and floor layers, outlines of structures, traces of hearths, and sometimes preserved wood in wet conditions, but the living house was more than its plan. It had patched places, smoke-polished places, chewed places where animals had been too interested, and corners darkened by use. A longhouse was not built once and then left alone. It was renewed in pieces. Turf, where it was used heavily, was a material of great intelligence. Cut from the ground in blocks, laid with care, it could make thick walls that resisted wind and held a steadier interior temperature. It was also heavy, damp if mishandled, and dependent on skill. A turf wall had to be thought of as a living edge between indoors and outdoors. It settled. It needed repair. Roots could help bind it. Frost and thaw could open weaknesses. The household watched it, just as they watched animals and children. Timber offered different advantages. Strong posts and beams created length and roof span. Planks could form walls or internal divisions. Wood could be shaped, pegged, joined, reused, and repaired. Yet timber was not equally available everywhere. In Iceland especially, usable wood could be scarce, and driftwood might be important. A beam was not merely a beam, it was a resource with a history, perhaps hauled from a distance or saved from an older building. To burn good structural wood carelessly would be like eating seed grain. The roof was a second landscape above the family. Thatch, reeds, shingles, or turf each behaved differently under rain, snow, and smoke. A roof had to shed water but also allow some smoke to find its way out. It had to be strong enough for weather and, in the case of turf, for weight. Snow could insulate, but too much weight was no joke. The quiet creak of a roof in winter was part of the household's nightly conversation with gravity. Inside, partitions and storage areas shaped warmth. A screen, hanging, chest, or stacked goods could break drafts. A byre partition could keep animals near while separating muck and hooves from sleeping people. Chests held textiles and valuables, but they also created edges and barriers in the room. Even a row of stored items could change how air moved. The house was arranged not as a showpiece but as a lived map of convenience. Floors deserve attention because cold rises into the body through feet and bedding when given the chance. Packed earth could be swept and renewed, but it held chill and sometimes damp. Wooden flooring, where used, made a difference, though boards were valuable and subject to wear. Rushes, straw, or other floor coverings could help, but they needed changing. A neglected floor covering became dirtier insulation than anyone wanted. Good housekeeping was not a modern fuss, it was part of thermal management. The central hearth also shaped the floor around it. Ash, charcoal, stones, and trampled paths marked its use. People learned exactly where sparks might jump and where children should not play. Cooking vessels, pot chains, hooks, stones, and tools formed a working zone. The hearth area was both sacred in the small domestic sense and dangerous in the practical one. It could keep the family alive, and it could destroy the house if treated foolishly. Smoke management was a skill learned by living with consequences. The fuel's dryness, the size of pieces, the placement of the fire, the opening of vents, and the wind all mattered. A smoky house might still be a warm house, but nobody should imagine people enjoyed stinging eyes for their own sake. They managed the draw as best they could. They chose fuel carefully when choice existed. They adjusted openings. They tolerated what could not be fixed and remembered it when repairs were possible. There were seasonal rhythms to the building itself. In autumn, before the deepest cold, a careful household examined roof edges, wall cracks, door fittings, and storage areas. A loose thatch bundle or weak turf seam that seemed minor in fair weather could become a nightly annoyance in winter. Moss, straw, scraps of cloth, clay, and spare pieces of wood might all become part of the campaign against drafts. Nothing useful was too humble to be used. The house also gave psychological warmth. This should not be dismissed as sentiment. In a dark season, a familiar interior mattered. People knew where tools hung, where the floor dipped, where the best warmth gathered, and where one could sit without blocking work. Familiarity reduced effort. A person half awake could find shoes, cloak, and hearth by memory. In winter, memory itself saved heat, because fumbling in the cold takes time. When we call the longhouse a winter machine, we do not mean it was coldly mechanical. We mean its parts worked together. The wall without the fire was not enough. The fire without the roof was not enough. The roof without stored fuel was not enough. The sleeping platform without bedding was not enough. But together, each modest advantage joined the next until life could continue in a climate that did not particularly care whether people were comfortable. This is why ordinary architecture deserves respect. A low door, a patched wall, a raised bench, a smoke-darkened rafter, a turf bank leaning against the wind, these are not background details. They are the technology by which families crossed the dark half of the year. Another way to understand the longhouse is to imagine its winter repairs as a language of small materials. Moss pressed into a gap says, "This draft has been noticed." A spare strip of wool tucked by a sleeping place says, "This corner is too sharp with cold." A new peg at the door says, "The wind found weakness here and was answered." These details do not make a house perfect, but perfection was not available. What mattered was whether the household had enough awareness to keep improving the shelter bit by bit. Storage inside or near the house also affected warmth. Grain bins and chests had to be placed where damp would not ruin them, but where they could still be reached. Hanging food away from animals and pests required thought. A loft or raised storage area might use warmer, drier air, though smoke and access created their own concerns. The arrangement of stores shaped movement through the room. A person reaching for grain in winter did not want to open a door or expose a storehouse longer than necessary. The house's darkness was part of its design problem. Openings admitted light, but openings also admitted cold. Before glass windows became common in later periods, light came through doors, vents, lamps, fire, and small openings that had to be balanced against weather. A bright house in winter might be a cold house if brightness came from careless gaps. The longhouse accepted dimness because dimness conserved warmth. People adjusted by moving tasks toward firelight and by knowing their tools through touch. There is a temptation to imagine the central hearth as always blazing warmly, but a real hearth had moods. It could smoke badly in damp weather. It could burn low when fuel was being conserved. It could send sparks at the wrong moment. It could leave one side of a person warm while the other side remained cool. Those gathered around it learned to rotate, shift, and negotiate. The hearth was a center, not a guarantee. Even soot had consequences. Smoke-darkened beams absorbed the years. Soot could be messy and irritating, yet the smoky environment also helped preserve certain foods and deter pests. A house that smelled strongly of smoke was participating in a practical chemistry that modern noses may not immediately appreciate. Warmth came with scent. Shelter came with residue. The past rarely separated comfort from inconvenience as neatly as we prefer. Maintenance of the roof could be especially urgent after storms. A loosened thatch, a damaged turf edge, or a leak above bedding could turn a cold night into a miserable one. Winter repairs were harder than autumn repairs, but sometimes unavoidable. Someone might climb or reach in poor weather, working quickly with numb hands, because a drip above stored grain or a sleeping platform could not wait politely for spring. Snow around the building could help or hinder. Drifted snow against low walls might reduce wind exposure, but blocked paths made chores harder. Packed snow near the doorway could become ice. A household might clear certain routes repeatedly, to the byre, the woodpile, the water source, the storage area. These paths were the winter veins of the farm. Keeping them open saved effort and sometimes prevented injury. The longhouse was also a place of fire safety. In a building made of timber, thatch, turf, textiles, straw, and stored goods, fire had to be respected. Sparks near bedding or drying wool were watched. Children learned boundaries. Lamps were placed carefully. The household needed flame, but never wanted flame to become independent. The safest warmth was controlled warmth, and control depended on constant habit. All of this means the longhouse should be seen as an active partner in winter life. It was not an inert box. It breathed through vents, held heat in walls, stored smells in beams, gathered people on benches, and reminded its inhabitants of every neglected repair. A family that cared for the house was, in a very direct sense, caring for its own bodies. When the wind pressed hard against the roof, the house answered with mass, shape, and memory. Mass slowed the cold. Shape turned the wind. Memory told people where to patch, where to sit, where to sleep, and when to add fuel. The winter machine ran on all three. The household's warmth also depended on boundaries within the farmyard. Fences, sheds, stacked fuel, and storage buildings changed the wind. A woodpile placed with thought could be reached without crossing the whole yard in a storm. A hay store too far from animals cost time and heat every morning. A path sheltered by a wall or fence saved effort over months. These arrangements may seem too small for history, but winter is built from small distances walked repeatedly. The entry area gathered many of these practical concerns. It might hold tools needed quickly, outer garments, bits of wood, or objects not welcome near sleeping places. It was also the zone where snow, mud, and cold tried to enter. A household that controlled its threshold controlled part of its climate. Snow knocked from shoes before stepping fully inside meant less meltwater on the floor. A cloak shaken at the right moment meant less damp wool steaming all night. Doors themselves needed winter care. Wood swelled and shrank with moisture and cold. Pegs loosened. Latches wore. A leather strap might stiffen. Ice could form where breath and damp met freezing air. The door was handled many times a day, and every handling tested it. A loose door did not merely annoy, it taxed the fuel pile. A well-fitted door was therefore a kind of stored firewood. Light from the hearth revealed the house in islands. The far corners were not unused, but they were less inviting after sunset. Objects needed in darkness had to be kept where hands could find them. This is one reason order mattered. A tool put back in its place saved searching. A missing awl, tinder bundle, or mitten could disrupt a morning. The more crowded and dim the room, the more valuable the habit of returning things to their proper spots. The house's smells also had information. A sharp damp smell might warn of wet bedding or a leak. A sour smell might point to spoiled food or dairy. Heavy smoke could reveal bad draft or poor fuel. Animal smells changed when stalls needed cleaning. The modern visitor might only think, smoky, crowded, strong. The household could read the layers more finely. Their noses were part of the management system. Cleaning, though different from modern expectations, was another winter technology. Ash had to be managed. Food scraps could not be left carelessly. Bedding needed shaking. Floors needed sweeping or renewing. Animal areas needed mucking. Pests were persistent, and winter did not remove them all. A cleaner house was not only more pleasant, it protected stores, textiles, health, and morale. The longhouse's warmth was therefore partly moral in the old domestic sense, it depended on discipline. Close the door. Put tools back. Patch the draft. Dry the socks. Watch the fire. Feed the animals before they suffer. None of these commands is grand, but together they form a household ethic. In cold climates, carelessness becomes visible quickly. When we imagine this house, then, we should not freeze it into one museum moment. It changes through the day. Morning smoke, midday chores, evening steam, night embers. Damp things dry. Dry things become damp. Fuel piles shrink. Bedding is folded and unfolded. Animals enter the soundscape and settle. The winter machine is always in motion, even when everyone seems still. Segment 2, Clothing, Bedding, and the Art of Wearing the House. To stay warm in a Viking Age winter, one did not wear a single miraculous garment. One wore layers, and those layers represented months of labor. Begin with linen, where available, close to the skin. Linen made from flax could be used for undergarments, shifts, shirts, and head coverings, though availability varied. It was not as warm as wool, but it was washable by the standards of the time and more comfortable against the body. Over linen came wool, the great northern companion. Wool could be woven into tunics, dresses, trousers, hose, wraps, cloaks, blankets, and countless useful pieces that do not look dramatic in museum cases but mattered intensely on a cold morning. Wool has a gift. It insulates even when damp better than many plant fibers. It can be spun thick or fine, woven in different weights, fulled to become denser, and layered. Sheep, in this sense, were walking future warmth. They turned grass into fleece, and fleece into the possibility that a human being might complain less in February. Every wool garment began before the loom. Sheep had to be raised, protected, and sheared or plucked depending on place and practice. Fleece had to be cleaned, sorted, combed or carded in some manner, spun into thread or yarn, then woven. Weaving on a warp-weighted loom required skill, time, and strength. Cloth was expensive not because a shop placed a fashionable label on it, but because human life had been poured into it hour by hour. This changes how we should imagine clothing. A cloak was not an accessory. A cloak was mobile shelter. A tunic was not just something to put on. It was stored labor. A patched sleeve was not a sign of failure. It was good sense. If a garment tore, someone mended it. If it wore thin, it might be patched. If it could no longer serve as a tunic, it might become wrappings, padding, children's clothing, or bedding. Cloth traveled through stages of usefulness until very little remained to discard. A winter outfit for a farm family member might include a linen underlayer, a wool tunic or dress, perhaps trousers or leggings, wool hose or foot wraps, a belt to hold garments close and carry tools, and a cloak fastened with a brooch or pin. Women might wear a long underdress and an overdress or apron dress in many contexts, with regional and chronological variation. Men might wear tunics and trousers of different cuts. Children wore smaller versions of practical clothing, often altered as they grew. Heads could be covered with caps, hoods, scarves, or veils. Hands needed mittens or wrappings. Feet needed shoes, socks, hay or wool stuffing, and constant attention, because cold feet are persuasive philosophers. They can convince anyone that life has taken a wrong turn. The key was trapping air. Layers hold small pockets of warmth. A belt could keep drafts from climbing under a tunic. A cloak could be wrapped tighter when crossing the yard. A hood or cap reduced heat loss from the head and protected ears. Mittens, often warmer than gloves because fingers share heat, made winter work possible. Even simple foot wraps could add insulation inside leather shoes. Leather shoes in the Viking Age were not modern insulated boots. Many were turned shoes, made inside out and then turned, practical but thin by modern winter standards. In wet snow or slush, feet could become cold quickly. People used wool socks, foot cloths, hay, or other insulating material. They dried footwear carefully. They avoided unnecessary soaking when possible. A pair of wet shoes by evening was not a small inconvenience, it was a household problem with toes attached. Clothing also had to breathe. Work outdoors could make a person sweat, and sweat in winter is treacherous. A damp underlayer chills when the work stops. So people adjusted cloaks, opened or closed layers, changed when possible, dried garments near the hearth, and learned the rhythm of labor, warm while moving, cold when still. Modern outdoor advice often sounds ancient because it is. Do not get wet. Do not let the wind steal your heat. Do not sit in damp clothing if you can help it. Eat enough. Keep your head covered. Your great-grandmother's great-grandmother did not need a glossy survival manual to know these things. Indoors, clothing remained important. The longhouse was warmer than outside, not warm like a modern living room set to a cheerful thermostat. People wore layers inside. They slept in clothing or wrapped in blankets, depending on custom, comfort, and what they owned. Removing everything for sleep in a cold house would be an ambitious experiment, and probably a brief one. Bedding was another form of wealth. Straw ticks, wool blankets, skins, cloaks, and woven covers made the difference between rest and misery. A straw mattress or tick could be refreshed when materials allowed. Straw traps air, softens a hard platform, and separates the sleeper from cold surfaces. It also needs management. It can become damp, compacted, or infested. The past is cozy only when edited. In real households, bedding had smells, textures, and maintenance duties. Animal skins and furs could be used, though we should be careful not to imagine every person luxuriously buried beneath heaps of fur. Availability depended on region, status, trade, hunting, and household resources. Sheepskins were practical in many farming contexts. A fleece side against the body is a persuasive argument for sheep. Wool blankets, cloaks, and bed covers could be layered. People shared sleeping spaces, partly because space was limited and partly because bodies are warm. Shared warmth was ordinary. Children might sleep together. Married couples shared beds or sleeping platforms. Servants or enslaved people, where present in society, had more modest arrangements. Household hierarchy did not vanish at bedtime. Warmth, like food, reflected status. The best bedding and best sleeping positions likely belonged to those with power, age, or importance within the household. Yet winter could soften some boundaries simply because a cold room encourages proximity. A sleeping platform along the wall might be lined with bedding and covered during the day or used as seating. At night, people settled under blankets, cloaks, and skins. The fire was banked. The room dimmed. Someone pulled a garment over cold ears. Someone else complained softly that another person's feet were like river stones. A child turned in sleep and stole half a blanket, an ancient behavior for which no archaeological solution has yet been found. Textile work occupied much of the winter evening because textiles were warmth in progress. Spinning could be done while talking. Weaving required more setup and space, but winter was a time for producing and repairing cloth. Mending was constant. A small tear in summer might be annoying. In winter it becomes a draft with ambitions. Seams were checked. Socks or foot wraps were repaired. Mittens were patched. Cloaks were brushed, dried, and shaken free of snow. Dyes and decoration existed, and people cared about appearance, identity, and status. The Viking Age world was not drab by necessity. Clothing could include color, patterned bands, tablet-woven trim, brooches, beads, and fine work. But warmth did not require ugliness or glamour. A useful garment could be handsome. A handsome garment still had to keep out the wind. The making of cloth was also the making of time. A spindle turning in winter is a small clock. Twist, draw, wind. Twist, draw, wind. Wool becomes thread. Thread becomes cloth. Cloth becomes a child's hood. The child's hood becomes, if all goes well, one less complaint on the walk to the cattle. Linen production, too, required enormous effort, growing flax, retting, drying, breaking, scutching, heckling, spinning, weaving. If a household had linen, it represented fields and water and labor. Linen underlayers could help keep wool garments cleaner by absorbing sweat and body oils. Washing wool frequently in winter was not convenient. Keeping the body reasonably clean and the underlayers maintained helped preserve outer garments. Cleanliness in the Viking Age is sometimes oversimplified. Archaeology gives us combs, tweezers, grooming tools, and evidence that personal appearance mattered. In winter, bathing and washing were shaped by weather and resources, but people did not simply surrender to filth as a lifestyle. Warmth and cleanliness had to be balanced. Wet hair in a cold house is not a delight. Laundering cloth in freezing weather is a project. Still, lice, fleas, smoke, sweat, and animal smells were real, and so were combs, washing, airing, and the desire to be presentable. Bedding might be aired when weather allowed, though winter allowed less. On dry, cold days, textiles could be shaken out. Smoke from the hearth permeated everything. This could be unpleasant, but smoke also helped deter some pests and preserve certain materials. A cloak that smelled of smoke was not necessarily dirty in the moral sense. It was participating in household chemistry. The body itself needed fuel. Clothing holds heat, but food makes heat. A person who has not eaten enough chills more easily. Winter diets varied by region and wealth, but might include stored grain, dairy products such as cheese or butter, dried or smoked fish, preserved meat, legumes were grown, roots, seaweed in some areas, and ale or other drinks. A warm porridge or stew did more than fill the belly. It sent heat outward into fingers. A cup held between hands was a small hearth. Clothing, bedding, and food together formed a personal climate. The longhouse created the larger shelter. Garments created a smaller house around each body. Bedding created a night shelter within the shelter. In a world before modern comfort, warmth was nested. There is a phrase we might borrow for this: wearing the house. A cloak on a winter errand is a wall. A hood is a roof. Mittens are tiny rooms for fingers. A blanket is a private longhouse in which the sleeper is both resident and furnace. This way of thinking also explains why losing clothing could be disastrous. A cloak taken in settlement of a debt, a blanket destroyed by damp, a pair of shoes ruined in thawing slush, these were not minor inconveniences. They were losses of stored labor and future comfort. Law codes from later medieval Scandinavia and saga literature, though written down after the Viking Age and shaped by literary purposes, often reveal how seriously people treated property like clothing, bedding, and household goods. These were the technologies of survival. On our imagined farm, the family knows each garment. This cloak belonged to an older brother before it was shortened. That blanket has a patch from a dress worn thin. Those mittens were made too large on purpose because the child will grow, and because a little extra room can hold a little extra wool. The household is wrapped not only in textiles but in memory. As evening deepens, the clothing changes function. Outdoor layers are shaken free of snow near the entry. Damp things are hung where heat can reach them without fire taking too much interest. Belts loosen. A woman sets aside a spindle only to pick up mending. A man checks the binding of a shoe. An older child rubs cold hands and is told, perhaps not for the first time, that hands warm faster when they are helping. The hearth glows. The benches fill. The house, the garments, the bedding, and the bodies begin their nightly cooperation. Color and texture belong to this world as well. It is easy to imagine winter clothing only in brown and gray, but dyed cloth, patterned bands, and careful fastenings were part of Norse dress where resources allowed. Madder, woad, weld, lichens, and other dye sources could produce colors of varying brightness and cost. Not every farm worker wore brilliant colors every day, and winter outer garments might be faded, smoke-darkened, or patched. Still, people cared how they looked. Practical clothing could carry identity, pride, and beauty. Fastenings were small but important technologies. Brooches, pins, toggles, ties, belts, and tablet-woven bands controlled layers. A cloak badly fastened leaves hands occupied and warmth escaping. A good pin holds the fabric where the wind cannot easily get under it. Belts gather fabric at the waist, keep tools near the body, and prevent drafts from traveling freely. A hood that can be pulled close around the face is worth more than a decorative flourish when snow is blowing sideways. The hands had their own winter story. Fingers are needed for nearly everything: milking, tying, carrying, cutting, feeding animals, sewing, lifting pots, and adjusting harness. Cold steals skill from fingers before it steals strength from the whole body. Mittens, wrappings, and the habit of warming hands inside sleeves or against the body were therefore practical necessities. A mitten might be made of wool cloth, nail-bound fabric, skin, or combinations depending on local practice and evidence. Nail binding, an older looping technique distinct from modern knitting, is known from Scandinavian contexts and could make warm socks and mittens. However made, hand coverings were precious. Feet were even more vulnerable because winter chores often began with standing on frozen ground. Leather shoes could be repaired, stuffed, greased, dried, and cherished, but they were not magic. Soles wore thin. Seams leaked. Snow worked its way in. People might add wool foot wraps, socks, dried grass, or hay for insulation. They might change wrappings when possible. They learned which pair of shoes could be trusted for the yard and which should not be soaked unless there was no choice. Drying footwear was an art of patience. Too far from the hearth, shoes remained damp and cold. Too near, leather could harden, shrink, scorch, or crack. The same was true of wool. A cloak needed warmth and air, not flames licking at the hem. In a crowded house, the drying area was valuable territory. A family member who hung wet things carelessly might endanger clothing that had taken months to create. Laundry and airing were shaped by weather. Linen underlayers, head coverings, and smaller cloths could be washed more readily than heavy wool, but winter made every washing decision serious. Water had to be fetched or heated. Cloth had to dry. Frozen laundry is clean in theory and stiff in practice. On clear cold days, airing bedding and shaking garments could freshen them. On damp storm days, the household endured smoke, wool, and humanity at close range. Personal grooming also contributed to comfort. Combs removed tangles and pests. Hair could be tied, covered, or kept under control. Beards, where worn, collected frost outdoors and smoke indoors. Nails, skin, and small wounds needed care because winter cracked and roughened the body. A split fingertip is not a grand historical event, but it can make every chore unpleasant. Grease, fat, or other household remedies might be used to protect skin, though details varied. The body itself was a tool to be maintained. Bedding had a social geography. The warmest and safest places were not randomly assigned. A high-status couple might have better coverings. An elder might be placed away from the worst drafts. Children might be bundled together because they were small furnaces with poor blanket discipline. Dependents and enslaved people, where present, might sleep with less comfort. The longhouse gathered people together, but it did not make everyone equal. Warmth reflected the household order. Straw ticks needed renewal. Fresh straw trapped air and smelled of field and storage. Old straw compressed, absorbed damp, and invited pests. Changing bedding required supplies and labor. In a poor year, people may do longer than they wished. In a better year, the sleeping platform could be refreshed more often. This is one reason harvest mattered beyond bread. Straw, hay, chaff, and plant materials had many lives on a farm. Blankets and cloaks blurred categories. A cloak worn by day could cover the body at night. A blanket might be wrapped around shoulders during a long evening. A sheepskin might serve as bedding, seat, or infant wrap. These flexible uses made textiles more valuable. The household did not own separate specialized objects for every modern purpose. It owned materials that could be shifted according to need. The production of these textiles was seasonal but never absent. Sheep were watched through the year. Lambing, grazing, shearing or gathering fleece, washing, sorting, spinning, weaving, dyeing, cutting, sewing, and mending formed a chain. A break in the chain appeared later as cold. If the fleece was poor, if spinning lagged, if moths or damp damaged stores, if a garment was lost, the winter body felt it. Women are often associated with textile work in Norse households, and archaeological finds such as spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, and textile tools remind us how central this labor was. Yet households were practical places, and tasks could vary by need, age, status, and skill. What matters for warmth is that textile knowledge was household power. It converted animal fiber and plant fiber into protection. Needles made small miracles. Bone, iron, or bronze needles repaired seams, attached patches, and turned scraps into useful objects. A neat patch could extend the life of a garment by years. A clumsy but functional patch could still save a sleeve from becoming a cold tunnel. Thread itself had to be made or carefully saved. Nothing about mending was trivial when replacement was slow. There is also a moral texture to mending. A patched garment says that someone noticed before the tear became ruin. It says the household valued continuity. In a sleep-friendly history, we may let that image rest quietly, a person near the hearth, head bent, adding small stitches to a child's hood while the child dozes nearby, unaware that tomorrow's comfort is being prepared in the dim light. Food, again, belongs in the clothing story because the body must have something to burn. Fat was especially valuable in cold weather. Butter, cheese, sour milk products, meat fat, fish oils, and rich broths could all matter where available. Grain porridge filled the belly, fat carried dense energy. People did not describe calories in modern terms, but they knew that hard outdoor work required food, and that thin meals made cold sharper. Drink could warm hands and spirits even when not hot by modern habit. Ale, soured milk, whey, water, broths, and other drinks varied by region and household. A warm bowl or cup near the hearth gave immediate comfort. Even the act of holding it slowed the evening. Fingers curved around warmth. Conversation softened. The body accepted help from inside and outside at once. To wear the house, then, was to participate in a whole economy of animals, fields, tools, and care. Linen kept wool cleaner. Wool trapped air. Leather protected feet. Belts held layers. Bedding caught sleep. Food fed the furnace. Mending guarded the future. A person wrapped in winter clothing was not isolated from the farm, they were wrapped in the farm's accumulated labor. The cut of garments also affected warmth. A sleeve that allowed movement without gaping was useful. A hem long enough to cover but not so long that it dragged wet snow indoors was sensible. An overdress, tunic, or cloak could be adjusted for sitting, working, and sleeping. Clothing on a farm had to move with labor. A beautiful garment that made chores clumsy belonged to special occasions, not to hauling hay in a storm. Wool cloth could be woven in different weights and finished in ways that changed its warmth. Fulling, which mats and thickens wool fibers, could make cloth denser and more resistant to wind. A fulled cloak or outer garment shed drafts better than loose weave. The exact processes varied, but the principle was clear: the way cloth was finished mattered as much as the fiber itself. Warmth was made in the details. Repair materials were stored carefully. Small scraps of cloth, bits of yarn, spare ties, pieces of leather, and worn-out garments all had future uses. A sleeve from one garment might become a patch for another. A torn hem might become binding. Old linen might become cleaning cloth or padding. The household's rag collection was not clutter. It was a reserve of solutions. Children learned the value of clothing partly by losing it. A misplaced mitten was not simply annoying. It could delay chores, cause tears, or require an adult to surrender time to search. A child might be told, with great seriousness, that the mitten did not walk away by itself. This statement has echoed through households for a very long time. Outer garments also carried weather information back into the house. Snow on a cloak told of the storm's character. Frost at the edge of a hood showed breath and cold. Wet hems warned of thaw or slush. By seeing what people brought in on their clothing, the household could read the outside world without opening the door again. A line of damp garments near the fire was a weather report in wool. Bedding, like clothing, had layers of quality. A fine wool blanket was different from a worn one. A thick sheepskin was different from a thin cover. A fresh straw tick was different from a flattened, damp one. The best combination was not always available, and households used what they had. The skill lay in arranging imperfect materials well, straw beneath, wool above, cloak added where the draft was worst, smaller child placed between warmer bodies. Sleeping in clothing could reduce the shock of morning. A person who kept some layers on under bedding could rise faster for night tasks or early chores. But sleeping in damp clothing was dangerous and uncomfortable. Thus the evening involved decisions: what can be dried, what must be worn, what can be spared as bedding, and what must be ready before dawn. The line between garment and blanket was flexible, but dampness made that flexibility complicated. Head coverings at night mattered too. A cap or wrapped cloth could make a cold sleeping space more bearable. Modern people often rediscover this when camping, as though they have invented an ancient solution. The Viking Age household needed no novelty. If ears were cold, cover them. If a draft found the neck, wrap it. Practical wisdom often sounds plain because it is already close to the body. The care of wool involved avoiding sparks, moths, damp, and unnecessary wear. Wool could be brushed or shaken. It could be aired. It could be patched before damage spread. A cloak thrown carelessly on a damp floor was an offense against many hours of labor. The household did not need to speak of sustainability, it lived inside the consequences of waste. There is a tenderness hidden in these practical textiles. A small hood made for a child, a larger mitten prepared before the child quite fits it, an extra fold placed over an elder's knees, a cloak shared during a cold story, such gestures are warmth as affection. They are not separate from survival. In a winter longhouse, care often took the form of covering someone properly. The social meaning of dress should not be separated from its warmth. Brooches, beads, bands, and better cloth showed relationships, status, and access to resources. A person could be both practical and proud. The past was not a place where people stopped caring about appearance because life was difficult. In fact, difficult conditions often make good clothing more meaningful. A fine cloak was admired because it was beautiful, useful, and costly in labor. Some garments carried histories of exchange. Cloth might be made in the household, received through marriage, traded, inherited, or given as a gift. A cloak could remember a parent. A brooch could mark a connection beyond the farm. A child's hand-me-down tunic might carry the shape of older siblings. In a winter house, memory was not abstract. It could be worn around the shoulders. The care of infants and small children required particular textile ingenuity. Babies needed wrapping, but they also needed to be kept dry. Cloths had to be changed, washed when possible, and dried. A caregiver might warm a small garment near the body before putting it on a child. The smallest people consumed a surprising amount of household attention, and their warmth depended entirely on others noticing quickly. Elders, too, could need adapted warmth. A person whose hands no longer spun quickly might still require extra covering over knees or shoulders. Arthritis is not named in the same way in all periods, but aging joints know cold in every century. A household that valued an elder's knowledge might also make space near heat when possible. Practical respect could look like the better seat on a hard night. Working clothing had to tolerate dirt. Animal care, fuel carrying, and yard work were not clean. A garment worn for chores might be patched more heavily and valued for toughness. Cleaner or finer clothing could be saved for visits, gatherings, or special occasions. This division protected the household's textile wealth. It also meant winter warmth had levels: the everyday, the repaired, the best, and the emergency extra layer brought out when the weather turned severe. The materials used for insulation did not stop at woven cloth. Loose wool, fleece, hay, straw, and skins could all help fill spaces, line sleeping areas, or protect bodies. The principle was simple: trap still air and block wind. People understood the effect through experience. A loose wrap flapping in wind failed. A layered, belted arrangement succeeded. A compressed, damp bedding layer lost comfort. A dry, fluffed one gave more. Some textile techniques produce stretchy or dense items especially useful for extremities. Nail-bound socks or mittens could be thick and warm. Woven bands held garments close. Braided ties secured wraps. Even a simple cord could improve warmth if it kept a hood snug or a cloak from opening. Small craft skills solved bodily problems. There is no need to imagine every person perfectly equipped. Poverty, bad luck, loss, fire, illness, or poor harvest could leave a household short. A thin blanket, worn shoes, or insufficient winter clothing would make life harder. This unevenness matters. The strategies we describe were known, but access to them varied. Historical care means seeing both the knowledge and the limits. Still, even modest households used ingenuity. An old cloak doubled at the feet. Straw was refreshed when possible. A child's garment was extended with a band at the hem. A hole was patched with whatever cloth remained. A shoe was stuffed and dried and used another day. Warmth often came not from abundance but from making scarce materials serve twice. The body learned to cooperate with clothing. People tucked hands into sleeves, sat on feet briefly, turned backs to wind, pulled shoulders inward, and used posture to conserve heat. A cloak works better when wrapped well. A blanket works better when edges are tucked. A hood works better when the neck is covered. The garment and the body formed one practiced system. At night, these habits continued without thought. A sleeper pulled cloth around the neck. A cold foot found a warmer place. A parent tucked a cover back over a child. Someone half awake adjusted a cloak without fully leaving sleep. The household's textile intelligence did not stop when eyes closed. Segment 3, The Evening Economy of Heat. Evening on a winter farm is not the end of work. It is the rearrangement of work around the fire. The outdoor chores must be finished before darkness swallows the yard completely, though in the far north winter daylight may be brief enough that the word before becomes flexible. Animals need fodder. Water must be managed, sometimes carried, sometimes freed from ice. Wood must be brought in. Doors and gates must be secured. Tools left outside in snow become tomorrow's irritation. A family learns to think ahead because winter punishes forgetfulness with impressive consistency. When the last person steps inside, the door closes quickly. Not slammed, if one values the door, but firmly. A gust enters anyway, because cold is rude. It sweeps along the floor, slips under hems, and reminds everyone why thresholds matter. Then the house absorbs it. The fire continues. The bodies settle. Warmth recovers. This is the evening economy of heat. Every action either saves, spends, creates, or wastes warmth. Cooking is central. A pot over the hearth may hold porridge, stew, or broth. The exact meal depends on season, stores, region, and status. Barley was an important grain in many Norse areas, made into bread, porridge, and ale. Oats, rye, and other grains appeared where conditions allowed. Dried fish might soften in a pot. Bits of preserved meat could flavor a stew. Dairy, especially from summer production preserved as cheese, butter, or sour products, added richness when available. Turnips, cabbages, onions, peas, beans, and gathered plants may enter the story depending on place and period. We need not invent a feast. Winter food was often repetitive, practical, and deeply appreciated when warm. The cooking fire warms the room while it warms the meal. Steam rises. The smell of food changes the emotional temperature before the physical one. A hungry household around a simmering pot is warmer in expectation. Fuel choice matters. Dry wood burns better and smokes less than damp wood. Peat, where used, burns differently, with its own smell and rhythm. Dung could be used as fuel in some societies and contexts, though we should be cautious about assuming uniform practice across the Norse world. Driftwood along coasts might be precious. Every landscape offered different fuel, and each fuel taught a different technique. Someone tends the fire with practiced attention. Too little, and the pot sulks. Too much, and fuel is wasted or food burns. A flame that is cheerful for guests may be extravagant for an ordinary night. The household wants heat, food, and embers for morning. This requires not romance but competence. Around the hearth, work continues. The winter evening is a workshop disguised as a family room. Wool is spun. Cloth is mended. Nets may be repaired in coastal areas. Wooden tools are carved or smoothed. Leather is patched. Metal objects, if needing serious smithing, belong elsewhere, but small maintenance can happen near the light. Harness, straps, buckets, bowls, and handles all require care. A farm is a collection of things trying to break slowly. Winter evenings are when people persuade them not to. The tasks are chosen for the light and the warmth. Fine work moves close to the hearth or lamp. Rougher work can be done farther back. Children are given tasks suited to age and patience, which are not always the same thing. They learn by watching. They learn how much wool to draw, how to twist cordage, how to hold a knife safely, how to patch a seam, how to listen when an elder says, "Not that way," unless you want to do it twice. Heat shapes posture. People sit with feet tucked under them or stretched toward the warmth. Cloaks wrap around shoulders. A person turns one side to the fire, then the other, like bread being toasted with opinions. Wet hems steam faintly. Mittens hang nearby. A sleeping infant may be tucked against a body, warmed by another person's work. The household also manages moisture. Snow tracked inside melts. Damp clothing releases steam. Cooking adds humidity. Animals nearby breathe and warm the air but also add moisture. Too much damp makes cold feel colder and encourages rot or mildew. Ventilation, drying, and storage matter. Grain must be kept from damp. Hay must not mold. Tools must not rust if iron is left wet. The house is always balancing heat against air, dryness against smoke, shelter against suffocation. Food stores are a quiet presence. In winter, much of the household's confidence lies in bins, barrels, lofts, hooks, and pits. Grain stored from harvest. Dried fish. Smoked or salted meat where available. Dairy products preserved from the warmer months. Nuts, berries, or herbs dried in season. These stores are edible warmth. They are calories waiting to become body heat. A thin storehouse makes a cold night feel colder. The evening meal may be simple, but it is communal. Bowls are filled. Bread may be shared. A stew that has accepted whatever the household can spare becomes the center of attention. Conversation lowers and rises. News is repeated. Weather is assessed with the seriousness it deserves. Someone predicts worse snow. Someone else says the wind is shifting. An older person names a winter years ago that was harder, because older people in every era keep a private archive of comparative discomfort. After eating, the room changes. Full bellies help. The work slows but does not necessarily stop. Stories may begin. The Viking Age North had rich oral traditions, genealogies, poems, memories, tales of gods and ancestors, local happenings, jokes, riddles, and practical knowledge wrapped in narrative. We must be careful not to treat later written sagas as direct recordings of every Viking Age fireside, but oral storytelling was unquestionably important in societies where memory carried law, reputation, and entertainment. For a sleep history evening, we need not choose a grand tale. We can imagine small stories. The year the cow broke through the weak fence and stood looking offended in the snow, the neighbor who stored hay badly and learned a lesson mice already knew, the ancestor who built the first version of this house, the time a child thought a frozen mitten was ruined and cried until it thawed by the hearth. History is made of such stories too. Laughter warms a room, though not enough to replace firewood. Still, it helps. The social order of the household appears in the evening. The farm owner and spouse, kin, dependents, servants, hired workers, and perhaps enslaved people all occupy different roles. The Viking Age included slavery, and an honest picture of ordinary life cannot erase it. But a sleep-friendly account need not dwell harshly, it can acknowledge that comfort and labor were not equally shared. Some people had better bedding, better clothing, more authority over the fire, and more say in when work ended. Warmth could be communal and unequal at the same time. Women in Norse households often held major responsibility for textile production, food preparation, dairy work, household management, and many forms of economic labor, though tasks varied. Men did farm work, animal care, building, woodcutting, tool maintenance, and many other duties. Children helped early. Elders contributed knowledge, supervision, craft, and memory where strength allowed. Winter survival was not a single person's achievement. It was distributed. Consider the simple act of bringing in fuel. Someone cut it. Someone stacked it. Someone noticed the indoor pile was low. Someone opened the door, endured the cold, carried it in, brushed snow away, and placed it where it could dry further but not become a hazard. Someone else decided when to add it. The warmth of the room is the visible result of invisible coordination. The same is true of a blanket. Sheep, pasture, shearing, sorting, spinning, weaving, fulling, sewing, mending. By the time a blanket lies over a sleeping child, it contains a whole year's worth of competence. A modern blanket may be bought with a click. This one was slowly argued into existence by hands. As night lengthens, the fire is prepared for sleep. The meal pot is moved or emptied. Sparks are watched. Ash is drawn. Embers are banked so they will last. The goal is not to keep everyone brightly awake but to preserve a living core. In some houses, a person may wake to tend the fire or check animals. In very cold weather, the boundary between sleep and vigilance is thin. A farmer sleeps with one ear available. The animals settle too. Cattle shift in stalls. Sheep press together. Their fodder is a calculation as serious as firewood. Hay cut in summer is winter life. Too little hay means hard decisions before spring. The warmth of animals under or near the same roof is comforting, but it comes with the responsibility of feeding them. They are not furry radiators. They are investments with stomachs. The smell of the evening is layered: smoke, stew, wool, leather, damp wood, hay, animals, human bodies, perhaps herbs, perhaps fish oil from a lamp. To modern imagination, it may seem strong. To the household, it is ordinary, and ordinary can be deeply comforting. A person returning from the yard enters that smell and knows they are inside the human world again. The long night ahead is not empty. It has a sequence. Finish food. Finish urgent work. Tell a little. Mend a little. Dry what must be dry by morning. Bank the fire. Arrange bedding. Check the door. Check the child. Check the embers again, because a sensible person trusts but verifies. There is a quiet humor in households everywhere. Someone always sits too close to the fire and then complains of being too warm on one side. Someone else always says they should move. Someone always claims not to be tired and then falls asleep mid-sentence. Someone always knows exactly where the missing needle is, except when asked. A mitten, placed carefully to dry, vanishes beneath a bench and is discovered later by a dog or a disgusted adult. The past was not solemn all the time. People were people, which is both historically accurate and reassuring. Outside, the northern night continues. The stars may be sharp above the roof. The moon, if present, turns snowfields blue. In some regions and latitudes, the aurora might appear, a pale shifting light across the sky, though not every winter night and not everywhere. The family inside may or may not step out to see it. Beauty competes poorly with warm bedding when the wind is high. The house grows quieter. Work objects are set aside. The loom waits. The spindle rests. Bowls are rinsed or stacked according to household habit. The fire becomes red and low. A final draft slips along the floor as someone checks the entrance. Then the door is closed for the night. Warmth now depends on all the preparations already made. The evening began earlier than a modern clock might expect, because winter light withdrew quickly. In many Norse regions, twilight was not a gentle decorative hour but a warning: finish what must be done outside. A misplaced tool, an open gate, an unlatched animal pen, or a forgotten bucket could become a problem by morning. The household learned to close the day deliberately. Water was one of the day's stubborn tasks. If a stream or well was near, reaching it in winter could still mean ice, slippery footing, and heavy carrying. Snow could be melted, but melting snow consumes fuel and produces less water than the hopeful eye imagines. Animals needed water too. A farm could not simply decide that winter chores were inconvenient. The bodies in the byre depended on human attention, and the humans depended on them in return. Hay was another form of heat. Not directly for people, unless one is speaking of bedding or insulation, but through animals. The cow fed with summer hay might later give milk. Sheep preserved through winter might give lambs and wool. A horse or ox, where present, represented strength for future work. Each armload of hay carried across the yard was a transfer of warmth from last summer's sun into the living bodies of winter. Inside, the evening meal was planned with the stores in mind. A household did not cook as though supply were endless unless supply was, in fact, generous. Grain was measured. Preserved foods were stretched. Bones could enrich broth. A small amount of meat or fat could flavor a larger pot. Fish, so important in many coastal and northern communities, could be dried, smoked, or otherwise preserved and then softened for eating. The pot made fragments cooperative. Bread in winter might be flat, coarse, and practical, depending on grain and equipment. Barley does not behave like modern wheat bread, but it can feed a household well. Porridge may sound plain until one imagines it after hours in cold wind. Then it becomes deeply persuasive. Warm, thick food is one of history's oldest comforts. The hearth required a choreography around the pot. Someone stirred. Someone shifted fuel. Someone kept children and dogs from making contributions no recipe required. Sparks were watched. Ash was useful, not merely waste. It could preserve embers, insulate coals, and become part of later cleaning or craft uses. The hearth produced heat, light, food, ash, smoke, risk, and routine all at once. Winter craft work was chosen with materials in mind. A piece of antler might become a comb tooth or handle. Bone could be shaped into small tools. Wood could become pegs, spoons, bowls, toys, repairs, or wedges. Leather scraps could patch shoes or straps. Cordage could be twisted. Nets and lines could be repaired in fishing households. Sledges, skis in some regions, snowshoes or simple aids to winter travel where appropriate, and farm gear all needed attention. The winter evening was full of unfinished practical objects. The light imposed limits. A small lamp with animal fat or fish oil could extend useful vision, but fuel for lamps was also a resource. People sat close. Eyes adjusted. Hands remembered. A craftsperson could feel when a stitch was right or a surface smoothed. Modern bright rooms make us forget how much work can be done by touch and habit. Sound organized the evening too. The spindle's soft whir, the thump of loom weights, the scrape of a knife on wood, the bubbling pot, the small click of a needle through cloth, these sounds told the household that things were in order. Silence could mean peace, but it could also mean the fire needed attention or a child had become suspiciously creative. Domestic history has always had an ear for suspicious silence. Teaching happened because it had to. A child learned by being given the end of a task that could be safely done badly at first. Wind yarn. Sort fibers. Fetch small sticks. Hold this, not that. Watch the pot, but do not lean over it. Carry one piece of wood, then two. The lessons were practical, repeated, and sometimes boring, which is how most essential knowledge enters human beings. Elders held another kind of heat, memory. They knew which winter stores had lasted, which shortcuts had failed, which neighbor had once ignored a roof leak until it became a household waterfall, which animal signs mattered, and when a cough sounded ordinary or worrying. Their physical labor might lessen with age, but their pattern recognition could be invaluable. A winter household could not afford to ignore experience. Guests changed the evening economy. Hospitality was a serious value in the Norse world, as in many pre-modern societies, but a guest also consumed warmth, food, and space. A traveler arriving cold could not be left outside without moral consequence, yet the household would feel the cost. Another bowl filled from the pot, another cloak steaming by the fire, another sleeping place found on the platform, kindness had weight. Trade goods and distant connections might appear in small ways around the winter hearth. A bead, a bit of imported cloth, a whetstone, a metal fitting, a soapstone vessel in some regions, or a quern for grinding grain could remind us that Viking Age farm life was not isolated from wider networks. Yet the presence of trade did not remove the nightly need to dry socks. Grand connections and humble chores lived side by side. Grinding grain itself was labor. Hand querns required time and strength. Flour did not arrive in a paper sack. Grain had to be threshed, winnowed, stored, and ground as needed. The warmth of porridge began long before the pot, and some of that warmth was generated by the arms that turned the stone. In winter, indoor labor could literally warm the worker while preparing food that would warm everyone else. The emotional economy of the evening deserves as much care as the material one. Short days can make people irritable. Crowding can sharpen small annoyances. Smoke can sting. Children can quarrel. Adults can worry quietly about stores. A calm longhouse was not guaranteed by its architecture. It was made by manners, hierarchy, affection, fatigue, humor, and the shared knowledge that everyone needed the night to go well. Music may have had a place in some evenings, a simple song, a chant, a remembered verse, perhaps an instrument in households where one was available. We should not fill every farm with constant performance, but human beings sing in dark seasons. Rhythm helps work. A tune can steady spinning or soothe a child. A low voice in a smoky room can make the wind outside seem farther away. Legal and social memory could also be rehearsed indoors. Genealogies, agreements, debts, marriages, boundaries, and local disputes were not separate from farm life. They shaped who had rights to land, animals, labor, and goods. In winter, people might discuss plans for spring assemblies, visits, exchanges, or repairs. Warmth for the body allowed planning for the social world. As the hour grew late, the household's attention narrowed toward preservation. What must be dry by morning? What food must be covered? Are embers safe? Are animals quiet? Is the door barred? Has anyone left a tool where a bare foot will discover it in darkness? The evening did not end with leisure alone. It ended with a checklist held mostly in memory. Banking the fire was a skilled conclusion. Large flames were allowed to fall. Coals were gathered. Ash was drawn over them. The aim was to slow the fire without suffocating it entirely. Different hearths and fuels behaved differently, the household knew its own. A visitor might see only ash. A resident knew where the red life slept. Then came the arrangement of bodies. The room that had been workshop and kitchen became bedroom. Daytime objects were shifted. Bedding was pulled out or unfolded. Cloaks changed purpose. Children were placed where adults could find them by touch. The firelight dropped lower, and the longhouse entered the form of warmth that asks the least fuel, stillness. The timing of evening tasks depended on daylight but also on fatigue. Winter work could be heavy even when the day was short. Carrying water, chopping or hauling fuel, tending animals, and moving through snow all spend strength quickly. By the time people settled near the hearth, the desire to rest was real. Yet the work closest to warmth still waited. This is one reason winter evenings feel slow in memory. Bodies were tired, hands kept moving, and the fire marked time. The household stores were counted not always with formal tally marks, but with practiced eyes. A person knew how quickly grain dropped in a bin, how much hay a cow consumed, how many bundles of fuel remained, and whether the cheese or dried fish would last if guests came. Counting could be quiet, almost private. The one responsible for stores might carry worry without announcing it, adjusting portions with care. Preservation methods shaped the winter menu. Drying removed moisture. Smoking added flavor and protection. Salting, where salt was available and affordable, helped preserve meat or fish. Fermentation and souring could keep dairy useful. Butter and cheese concentrated the summer's milk. Each method required timing and knowledge. Winter warmth in the bowl depended on summer and autumn preservation done correctly. The evening pot made use of texture as well as flavor. Hard-dried food softened. Grain swelled. Tough pieces yielded slowly. A stew or porridge over the hearth allowed time to do what teeth might not want to do alone. In a household with elders or small children, soft warm food could be especially important. The pot was communal technology, turning stored hardness into shared comfort. Utensils and vessels mattered. Wooden bowls and spoons held warmth differently from metal. Soapstone vessels, known in parts of the Norse world, could retain heat well. Iron cooking equipment was valuable and had to be cared for. Broken pottery, cracked wood, or damaged handles were not trivial. A bowl that leaks is a small disaster when food is limited and the floor is not meant to be fed. There were also winter tasks of planning. Which animal might be bred? Which field needed attention when thaw came? Which roof repair must be first? Who needed new shoes before a journey? Who might visit kin or attend a gathering when weather allowed? The long evening allowed talk that summer busyness pushed aside. Warmth gave people a place to think beyond the next chore. The presence of animals nearby influenced evening rhythm. Their feeding might be heard through partitions. Their warmth mingled with the households. Their smell did too. A modern division between living space and animal space was not always possible or desirable in the same way. On many farms, animals were economic partners so important that their comfort shaped human routines. Damp from animals, cooking, and clothing could make the house feel close. Ventilation might be opened briefly despite the cold, because stale smoky damp air has its own discomfort. This was another balance with no perfect answer. Open and lose heat, close and endure smoke and moisture. The skilled household adjusted rather than followed a rigid rule. As people grew sleepy, speech might become softer. A story begun with energy could trail into murmurs. A spindle might slow. A knife might be set down before tired hands made a mistake. Knowing when to stop was also competence. Winter rewarded work, but it punished clumsiness, and clumsiness grows in the late hour. The last waking moments might include small prayers, charms, habits, or thoughts shaped by the beliefs of the time and place. Norse religion and later Christianity overlapped differently across the Viking Age, varying by region and century. We need not stage a ceremony to acknowledge that people carried unseen meanings into the night. A hearth, a threshold, a sleeping child, a storm outside, all could gather more than practical attention. The evening meal also carried social signals. Who was served first, who received the richest portion, who sat where, and who cleaned afterward reflected the household's order. Yet winter need could complicate hierarchy. The person who had been outside longest might be urged closer to the fire. A child might be fed quickly to stop shivering. An animal emergency might delay everyone. Practical life softened and reinforced status in turns. Salt deserves a quiet mention. Where available, it was valuable for preservation, but it was not equally abundant everywhere. Salted foods could carry summer and autumn into winter, yet salt itself had to be produced or acquired. In coastal areas, fish preservation might be central to survival. Inland farms relied on different balances of grain, dairy, meat, and stored plants. There was no single Viking menu, only regional solutions to the same cold season. Dairy work shaped winter comfort long before the snow. Milk from cows, goats, or sheep could be consumed fresh in season, but preservation made it useful later. Cheese, butter, skyr-like cultured products in Icelandic contexts, sour milk, whey, and other forms extended the life of summer abundance. A spoonful of fat or dairy in winter food could change both taste and energy. The warm bowl carried the pasture into the dark. Meat was also tied to seasonal decisions. Animals might be slaughtered in autumn when fodder limits became clear, and meat preserved for winter when possible. This was not only culinary, it was arithmetic. Which animals could be fed through winter? Which should be eaten? Which must survive for breeding, milk, wool, traction, or status? Warmth in the longhouse depended on these sober autumn choices. Grain storage required vigilance. Mice, damp, mold, and theft of small amounts by pests could threaten the household's confidence. Bins, chests, sacks, and storage pits had to be protected. A winter evening discussion about stores may sound dull until one remembers that every missing measure of grain meant fewer bowls of porridge. The cold makes accounting emotional. Firewood preparation also had its calendar. Wood cut too late or stored poorly smoked and burned inefficiently. Drying required space and planning. Peat, where used, had to be cut and dried in advance. Brushwood could catch quickly but vanish quickly. Larger wood held heat longer. Kindling was the bridge between ember and flame. A household that neglected kindling turned every morning into a test. There were rhythms of indoor air that people learned physically. After cooking, the house might feel damp and warm. After a door opened several times, it might cool sharply. When wind shifted, smoke might descend. When many people gathered close, body heat increased, but so did moisture and smells. No written thermometer was needed. Skin, eyes, lungs, and mood reported the room's condition. Children absorbed these signals. They learned that a smoky hour did not mean panic, but a spark in straw did. They learned that a cold draft near the floor could be blocked with a rolled cloth, but that blocking every opening could make smoke worse. They learned that fuel should be sorted by purpose, small dry pieces to wake flame, larger pieces for longer heat, poor pieces when smoke mattered less. Such learning made future adults. A winter evening might include repair of containers as much as clothing. Buckets, tubs, barrels, and bowls held food, water, dairy, and grain. A leaking vessel wasted labor. Wooden containers dried, swelled, cracked, and needed care. Hoops, pegs, resin, pitch, or careful woodworking might be involved depending on the object. The warmth of soup began with a vessel that could hold it. Tool edges also mattered. Knives, axes, sickles, and other edged tools had to be maintained. Serious smithing might happen elsewhere or in a dedicated area, but sharpening and small repairs could be part of evening work. A dull axe makes wood cutting harder, and harder wood cutting means more sweat, more fatigue, and less efficient warmth. Tool care and body heat are more connected than they first appear. The winter evening gathered all these chains into one room. Food chain, fuel chain, textile chain, tool chain, animal chain, memory chain. The hearth sat at the center, not as a romantic symbol alone, but as the place where chains met. Around it, the household converted stored summer into livable night. Segment 4, Endless Northern Night and Morning. The phrase endless northern night is poetic, but winter darkness was a practical fact. At high latitudes, daylight can shrink to a brief, slanting visitor. Even farther south in Scandinavia and the North Atlantic, winter days are short, and bad weather can make noon feel like an unfinished dawn. People organized life around this seasonal darkness. They did not need to be surprised by it every year, though one may know a thing is coming and still be annoyed when it arrives. Night in the longhouse is a slow rearrangement of warmth. At first, bodies are warm from food and movement. Bedding holds the heat. The embers glow. The air near the roof may still hold smoke and warmth. Lower down, the chill begins to gather in corners and along the floor. The thick walls slow the outside cold, but do not abolish it. A sleeper curls slightly. Another pulls a cloak tighter. A child presses against a sibling. The dog, having solved winter, occupies the most advantageous permitted spot. Sleep in such a house is communal sound. Breathing. A cough. A murmur. A sheep shifting. A log settling into ash. Wind touching the roof. Somewhere a rope creaks. Snow may slide softly from thatch. If the weather is severe, the whole building speaks, beams creak, walls mutter, the door strains. Yet this is not necessarily frightening to those who know the house. These are familiar voices. A house that creaks in winter is often just reporting that it remains standing. Someone may wake in the dark to check the fire. This requires the discipline of leaving warmth, which is among the highest forms of domestic courage. The person rises, wraps a cloak, and moves carefully. The room is a geography of sleeping bodies, tools, benches, and low light. Bare feet are unwise. A coal glow remains under ash. With a practiced hand, the tender exposes it, adds small fuel, encourages a little life, then covers or feeds it as needed. Too much flame wastes fuel and wakes the room. Too little risks losing the fire. The ideal is a quiet endurance. If the fire has survived, morning will be easier. If it has not, the day begins with irritation and labor. Fire-making methods existed, of course: flint and steel, tinder, embers carried or shared, and other techniques depending on period and place. But relighting from cold in a dark, freezing house is not the preferred opening to anyone's day. Banking embers is the more elegant solution. The animals may need checking during severe cold. A cow in distress, a lamb too chilled, a door loosened by wind, these are not matters one can postpone until a convenient century. The farm household sleep is connected to the health of its animals. In winter, livestock are not background. They are future milk, wool, traction, meat, manure, status, and survival. Their warmth helps the house, and the house protects them, and the family protects both. Darkness also changes the mind. Long winter nights can invite closeness, reflection, boredom, storytelling, and worry. A household waiting for spring count stores. Is there enough hay? Enough grain? Enough dried fish? Enough fuel? Enough patience? The answer may vary by week. And yet winter was not only hardship. It was also a season of indoor skill. Summer pulled people outward into fieldwork, travel, grazing, fishing, building, gathering, and harvest. Winter gathered them inward. Children heard more stories. Tools were repaired. Cloth grew on the loom. Plans formed. Social bonds tightened, sometimes comfortably, sometimes like a knot in wet wool. The morning comes slowly. Before dawn, or what counts as dawn in the deep winter north, someone stirs. The first waking person meets the coldest part of the household day. Bedding has done its work, but the air has cooled. The fire must be revived. Hands emerge reluctantly. A cloak is found. Shoes or foot coverings are reached for with the seriousness of ritual. The embers, if preserved, glow like a promise. Small fuel catches. Smoke thickens, then rises. The room changes from black to red to dim gold. Shapes return: beams, hanging cloth, bowls, sleeping forms, the curve of a pot. A child wakes and pretends not to, hoping work will choose another target. This strategy is ancient and rarely successful. Morning warmth begins in layers. First the fire. Then clothing adjusted and tightened. Then warm food or drink if stores allow. Porridge reheated, broth warmed, leftovers made useful. The body's furnace must be fed. Outdoor chores wait with no sympathy at all. Before stepping out, people dress carefully. Cloak. Hood. Mittens. Foot wraps. Belt. Knife. Perhaps a wooden pail, a fork, a tool for breaking ice. The door opens and winter enters. For a moment the house loses heat in a visible mood. The person slips out quickly. The door closes. Inside, the room recovers again. Outside, the farm is pale and hard. Snow squeaks underfoot in deep cold. Breath clouds. The sky may be only slightly lighter than night. The person crossing the yard carries the house with them in clothing, wool, linen, leather, habit. The longhouse behind them leaks a little smoke into the morning, a sign of life as clear as any banner. Chores generate warmth. Hauling water, carrying hay, clearing a path, tending animals, these tasks are cold at first, then warming, then sometimes sweaty, which must be managed. A person may loosen a cloak while working and wrap it tight again when stopping. The body is its own weather system, changing with labor. Inside, others wake. Bedding is shaken or folded back. Children are dressed. The day's work is divided. The fire becomes useful for cooking again. Light grows, if the day permits. In storm weather, the world beyond the door may remain a gray blur, and the house becomes once again the main universe. This cycle repeats through winter. Heat is made, spent, saved, and made again. A family does not survive the endless northern nights through one heroic act. They survive through thousands of small competent acts, patching a roof, spinning thread, stacking fuel, drying mittens, sharing bedding, feeding animals, banking embers, closing the door quickly, eating enough, checking the hay, telling a story when spirits sag. The genius of ordinary life lies in repetition. Modern history often prefers events that break the pattern. But most human beings, in most times, lived by maintaining patterns that should not break. The warm longhouse at midnight is one of those achievements. In the deepest part of the night, the house kept different temperatures at once. Near the embers, warmth lingered. High under the roof, smoke and warmer air collected before escaping slowly. Along the walls and floor, cold pressed in. A sleeping person knew these layers without measuring them. To pull a blanket higher, curl the knees, or turn away from a draft was a form of bodily knowledge. The banked hearth was not bright enough to make the room familiar in the ordinary way. It made shapes into suggestions. A pot became a dark curve. A hanging cloak became a shadow. A bench edge waited for shins. Moving through such a room required memory and caution. People who lived together learned not only each other's voices but the locations of each other's sleeping forms. Infants and very young children needed special care. They were warmth seekers and warmth losers, small bodies dependent on adults, siblings, and bedding. They might sleep close to a mother or caregiver, wrapped carefully but safely according to the habits of the time. Their cries in the night were not only interruptions. They were information: hunger, cold, discomfort, illness, or the ordinary outrage of being small in winter. Illness changed the household's relationship to warmth. A fever, cough, weak elder, or chilled child might require the better place near heat, extra covering, warm drink, or night watching. Viking Age medical understanding was not modern, but care existed in practical forms, keeping someone warm, fed, cleaned, watched, and comforted. In winter, nursing was another heat economy, directing scarce comfort toward the vulnerable. The animal's night sounds could be soothing or alarming. A steady shifting in the byre was ordinary. Repeated distress was not. The family knew the difference between a sheep settling and an animal caught badly, between the normal breath of cattle and a problem. In very severe weather, someone might check that water had not frozen beyond use, that doors held, or that a young animal remained warm enough. Such checking was tiring, but losing livestock could be far worse. Outside, winter continued its own work. Snow drifted. Ice tightened on water. Wind searched seams. Moonlight, when present, made the farmyard almost luminous. Without moon, the dark could be thick, broken only by stars, snow glow, or the faint leak of hearth light through openings. To step outside at such an hour was to feel immediately how much the house had been doing. The contrast between inside and outside was not always dramatic in degrees, but it was decisive in effect. Inside there was less wind. Inside there were embers, bodies, covers, and known paths. Inside, a person could survive by sleeping. Outside, stillness could become dangerous quickly. The longhouse did not need to be warm by modern standards to be life-saving. It only needed to turn exposure into shelter. Time moved differently in the winter dark. People without mechanical clocks read duration through fire, stars, animal habits, hunger, and bodily rhythm. A night watch might judge by how low the embers had fallen or by a familiar change in the wind. The return of dawn was not a sharp event but a slow lessening of blackness. In far northern winters, daylight could feel like a brief guest who never removes its cloak. Dreams may have carried the day's tasks forward. A person worried about hay might dream of empty racks. Someone who had spun for hours might feel the twist of thread in sleep. A child promised a story might dream of it. We cannot recover such dreams from archaeology, but we can say that sleep in a working household is never separate from work. The mind uses the materials it has been given. When morning approached, cold had often gained ground. The human body's underbedding remained warm, but the room itself waited for revival. This made the first riser important. That person performed a small daily rescue. Find the cloak. Find the foot coverings. Move carefully. Reach the hearth. Test the ash. Discover whether yesterday's care had lasted. If the embers glowed, the household had won a small victory. Dry tinder, slivers of wood, bark, shavings, or other kindling could coax flame back. Breath had to be controlled. Too little and nothing happened, too much and ash flew where nobody wanted it. The first smoke might be thick and low before the draw improved. Eyes watered. Still, flame returned, and with it the day. If the embers were dead, the mood would be different. Fire could be made, but making it in darkness and cold cost time. Flint and steel, suitable tinder, and patience might be needed. In some communities, embers could be borrowed from a neighbor if nearby and circumstances allowed, though going out to fetch fire in winter was hardly convenient. Preserved fire was therefore a form of domestic grace. Breakfast did not need to be elaborate to be important. Leftover porridge loosened with liquid, broth reheated, bread warmed near the fire, a bit of cheese, fish, or butter if available, these things prepared bodies for cold work. Eating before chores might not always happen in the order a modern person would prefer, because animals could be urgent. But food and labor were joined. Work warmed the body, food allowed the work. Morning chores renewed the cycle of heat. Feeding animals kept future warmth alive. Carrying water supported bodies. Clearing paths saved effort later. Bringing in fuel replaced what the night had consumed. Shaking bedding reduced damp. Opening vents or adjusting the smoke hole improved air. Each act made the house ready to gather warmth again when daylight faded. Weather decided how wide the day could become. On a clear winter day, people might travel short distances, check traps, cut or haul wood, repair fences, visit a neighbor, or work outside as needed. On a storm day, the world narrowed to house, byre, woodpile, water, and only the most necessary paths. The ability to stay warm indoors made such narrowing survivable. We should remember that winter varied by year. A mild winter might bring mud, damp, and disease among animals. A hard winter might preserve surfaces but demand more fuel and fodder. Late snow could threaten spring plans. Early thaw could spoil stored materials. Families carried not just one winter in memory, but a catalogue of winters, each with lessons. The house was adapted by experience accumulated over generations. The quiet triumph of ordinary warmth is that it leaves few dramatic traces. Archaeologists may find hearths, post holes, charred grain, textile tools, animal bones, and building remains. They may infer patterns of diet, craft, and architecture. But the sensation of a child's feet finally warming under a blanket, or the relief of seeing embers alive before dawn, does not fossilize. We must reconstruct it carefully from material evidence and human common sense. Careful reconstruction also means avoiding exaggeration. Not every Norse family lived in constant misery, and not every longhouse was cozy in the modern storybook way. Some households were prosperous, some poor. Some buildings were better kept than others. Some winters were manageable, some frighteningly lean. Warmth was uneven. Yet across these differences, the same broad strategies appear: shelter, insulation, fire, food, textiles, shared space, and attention. As the day begins, the longhouse again becomes a place of motion. Smoke rises. People speak in morning voices. Someone searches for a missing belt. Someone finds a shoe colder than expected. A child is urged toward a task. An elder comments on the wind. The animals answer with their own demands. The house that seemed almost asleep an hour before is once more a machine of life. By evening, the pattern will gather again. The same door will open and close. The same hearth will receive fuel. The same benches will hold work and then sleepers. The same wool will be dried, patched, worn, and pulled close. The repetition is not failure of imagination. It is the structure of survival. So when we ask how Viking families stayed warm, the most truthful answer is plural. They stayed warm by building with the land rather than against it. They stayed warm by respecting fuel as labor. They stayed warm by turning sheep into cloth and cloth into layers. They stayed warm by treating food stores as future body heat. They stayed warm by arranging people, animals, walls, and embers into a cooperative shelter. Above all, they stayed warm by paying attention. Attention is a gentle word for a demanding practice. It means noticing the draft before the child sleeps beside it. It means noticing damp hay before it spoils. It means noticing that the fire is burning too fast, that the mitten is too near flame, that the door peg has loosened, that the elder needs the warmer place tonight. In a northern winter, attention was warmth made visible. And as our imagined household moves into another morning, that attention continues. There is no final victory over winter, only another competent day. The cold remains outside the walls, patient as ever. Inside, the family answers with porridge, wool, smoke, hay, stitches, and hands. One more detail is worth carrying with us: warmth was never only a possession. It was a relationship between people and their surroundings. The Norse farmer did not command winter to leave. The household negotiated with it through design and habit. A wall did part of the work. A cloak did part. A bowl of food did part. A shared bed did part. Even patience did part, because impatience opens doors too long, burns fuel too quickly, and neglects the small repairs on which comfort depends. Regional differences add richness to this picture without changing its heart. In Iceland, where turf building became especially important, the earth itself could form deep sheltering walls. In wooded districts of Scandinavia, timber construction could offer other possibilities. Along coasts, fish and driftwood might shape winter routines. Inland, cattle, sheep, grain, and hay might dominate attention. Some households had more iron, better cloth, stronger roofs, larger stores, and more laboring hands. Others balanced closer to scarcity. Yet in all of them, the problem of warmth was solved through combinations rather than miracles. The archaeological record reminds us to be humble. A loom weight does not tell us every conversation held beside it. A hearth stone does not tell us who warmed their hands there. A post hole does not preserve the sigh of relief when a roof held through storm. But these remains do tell us that ordinary domestic skill was abundant. People built, cooked, spun, mended, stored, fed, burned, swept, patched, and slept. Their winter knowledge was embedded in practice, not displayed as theory. There is a quiet dignity in that practical knowledge. It belongs to the person who knows which fuel smokes least, the person who can spin evenly while listening to a story, the person who wakes at the right sound from the byre, the person who cuts a patch from an old garment without wasting cloth, the person who banks embers so carefully that morning begins with flame instead of frustration. None of these acts asks to be carved on a stone. They simply keep people alive. If we could stand for a moment just inside the doorway, careful not to let in the wind, we might notice how many forms of warmth overlap. The fire warms the pot. The pot warms the meal. The meal warms the body. The body warms the bedding. The bedding allows sleep. Sleep restores the worker. The worker brings fuel, tends animals, repairs walls, and keeps the fire alive. Warmth circles through the household like a slow, practical song. This circle is why the long northern night, however dark, was not empty. It was filled with exchanges: heat for fuel, labor for food, attention for safety, closeness for comfort, memory for competence. A household that understood these exchanges could make a winter night bearable, sometimes even peaceful, without pretending it was easy. The middle of the night could also reveal the value of good storage. If kindling had been kept dry, the fire tender had hope. If small fuel was nearby, no one needed to open the door. If shoes were placed properly, a person could rise without searching the cold floor. Night comfort was prepared in daylight by arrangements so ordinary that no one praised them unless they failed. A sleeping platform along the wall held more than bodies. It held the hierarchy of the room, the habits of years, and the pattern of family life. The same place might be used by the same person night after night until it seemed almost part of them. A newcomer would not automatically know where to lie, where to put a cloak, or which corner caught the draft. Belonging to a household meant knowing its winter map. The night watch, if there was one, did not need to be formal. A nursing mother awake with a child might glance at embers. An elder who slept lightly might notice the wind. A farmer worried about an animal might rise once. These overlapping wakefulnesses created a loose net of attention. The house slept, but not all at once, not completely. Cold has a way of making time feel longer. A comfortable sleeper may pass hours without noticing, while a chilled one counts every small sound. This is why bedding quality mattered so deeply. It affected not only comfort but the perception of night. A warm enough person could dream. A cold person negotiated with every minute. Morning smoke was one of the farm's signs of survival. From outside, a thin rise of smoke told neighbors, if any were near enough to see, that the household had fire. It suggested food, waking, and continued life. Smoke from a roof opening was not picturesque to those who made it, it was evidence of work begun again. The first opening of the door in the morning was a small surrender and a small assertion. Cold entered, but so did the day. The person going out carried tools, clothing, and purpose. The house lost heat, then recovered. This pulse repeated through winter so many times that it became invisible. Yet each pulse was a negotiation with the season. The long northern night, then, was crossed not by staying motionless until spring but by alternating rest and readiness. Sleep mattered, but so did the ability to wake, tend, adjust, and begin again. The household's warmth was durable because it was not passive. Even at rest, it was prepared to act. In the final hours before dawn, the mind may move between worry and trust. Trust in the roof, because it held last night. Trust in the embers, because they were banked well. Trust in the animals, because they settled after feeding. Trust in the stores, because someone counted them. Trust in the person beside you, because shared warmth is also shared fate. Winter made dependence plain. This dependence extended beyond one household. Neighbors, kin, and local communities mattered. Borrowed tools, exchanged labor, shared news, marriages, fosterage, trade, and help in emergency all shaped winter security. A farm was not floating alone in darkness, even when snow made it feel isolated. The smoke of another house, if visible, was a reminder that other people were also keeping embers alive. Travel in winter was possible but serious. Frozen ground could make some routes easier than mud, while storms could make them dangerous. People used skis in some Scandinavian regions, sledges where conditions allowed, boats where waters remained passable, and feet everywhere. Clothing for travel had to be especially reliable. A traveler arriving at a longhouse brought not only news but cold, hunger, and the need for hospitality. The household that received a winter visitor had to stretch warmth. A place by the fire, a portion from the pot, a place to sleep, a chance to dry clothing, these were practical gifts. Hospitality appears in literature with honor attached, but at farm level it also meant managing resources. The moral world and the material world met at the hearth. Mourning after a guest's arrival might include exchange of information, road conditions, weather signs, health of neighbors, prices, disputes, marriages, deaths, births, and news from farther places. Such news could guide decisions. Should one attempt a journey? Is a storm coming? Has a disease affected animals nearby? Warmth of community was partly knowledge shared in winter rooms. The return of daylight did not erase darkness, it only paused it. During the shortest season, morning could feel like a brief gray permission to complete urgent tasks before evening gathered again. This made efficient routines essential. Delay in morning stole from afternoon. A household that moved well in the first light bought itself more safety before the next night. The first smoke, the first stirred pot, the first creak of the door, the first animal call, these were the day's opening notes. They did not announce adventure. They announced continuity. Continuity is one of history's most underrated achievements. To wake, feed, mend, warm, and begin again through winter is to perform a quiet triumph that leaves little written record. As we let the scene soften, we can hold both truths. Viking Age winter life could be harsh, smoky, unequal, and physically demanding. It could also be skilled, intimate, resourceful, and at times peaceful. The same hearth that stung the eyes warmed the hands. The same crowded bench that limited privacy kept sleepers alive. The same repetitive chores that wearied the body made morning possible. This balanced view is gentler because it is truer. We do not need to turn the past into a fairy tale to find comfort in it. The comfort lies in competence, in adaptation, in people learning the grain of their world and living with it as wisely as they could. The northern night remains large in our imagination, but inside the longhouse it is met by human scale. A needle. A bowl. A cloak pin. A handful of kindling. A child's blanket pulled into place. A cow fed before dawn. A door closed quickly. These are small things, and they are enough to carry life forward. There is one final kind of warmth to notice before we close the door on the scene, the warmth of routine itself. A routine does not raise the temperature of a room in any measurable way, yet it steadies the people inside it. When everyone knows the order of evening tasks, less energy is wasted deciding. The child brings small wood. The older hand checks the pot. Someone shakes snow from the threshold. Someone sees whether the animals have settled. Someone sets aside dry kindling for morning. The pattern is familiar enough to be calming. Routine also protected against fear. Winter darkness can make imagination busy. A noise outside, a hard gust, a sudden fall of snow from the roof, all these could startle. But a household trained by many nights had answers. Listen first. Is the door secure? Are the animals quiet now? Is the roof still holding? Is the fire safe? The ordinary sequence of checking turned uncertainty into action, and action into calm. For the youngest members of the household, winter routine became memory long before it became understanding. They would remember the smell of smoke in wool, the weight of a blanket, the glow under ash, the low voices after supper, the command to close the door quickly, the relief of warm food, the mild injustice of being sent to fetch something when they had just become comfortable. Years later, those sensations might become their own household wisdom. For adults, routine held responsibility. The same tasks repeated because the same needs returned. Fire consumes. Bodies hunger. Animals require fodder. Cloth wears thin. Doors loosen. Snow blocks paths. Embers fade. The repetition could be tiring, but it was also reassuring in its honesty. Winter did not ask for cleverness every hour. Often it asked for the known thing done at the right time. This is perhaps the gentlest lesson from the Viking Age winter farm. Warmth is not always dramatic comfort. Sometimes it is the quiet confidence that the household knows what to do next. A dry place for the shoes. A covered ember. A folded cloak. A child tucked back under wool. A hand reaching through dimness and finding exactly where the kindling was left. Even the quiet act of leaving something ready for the next person belonged to this warmth. A cloak placed within reach, a bowl set where it would not be kicked, a few dry splinters saved from the evening fire, a path swept once more before sleep, these gestures carried care forward through darkness. The person who benefited might never say thank you, because the act was part of the household's normal order. Yet normal order is often where care hides best. In this way, the winter longhouse was warmed by anticipation. People imagined the needs of morning before morning arrived. They imagined the cold hands, the hungry animals, the dim room, the reluctant child, the sleepy fire. Then they prepared small answers in advance. History often records what people did after trouble came. Domestic history also asks what they did so trouble would arrive softened. And so, as our visit ends, let us return to the sleeping room. The fire is low but alive. The roof holds. The walls resist the wind. The benches are crowded with bundled forms. Wool blankets rise and fall with breathing. Somewhere near the byre, an animal shifts and settles. A spindle waits for morning. A cloak dries slowly, carrying the smell of smoke. The cold presses against the outside of the house, patient and immense, but inside it has been reduced to something manageable. Not conquered. Managed. That is the old northern wisdom. Winter does not need to be defeated in a song. It needs a patched wall, a full hayloft, a dry pair of socks, a steady hearth, and someone who remembers to cover the embers. The night stretches on. The family sleeps within its layers, turf and timber, smoke and wool, straw and skin, kinship and habit. Beyond the roof, stars turn above snow. Within, warmth remains, quiet and shared. And in that modest glow, through the endless northern night, the household keeps tomorrow possible.